Nora is a technical specialist at the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA, where her work seeks to catalyze R&D that can help make a transformative AI go well. She helps manage a £59 million backed program which prototypes provable guarantees for safety-critical applications of AI. She also recently worked on hardware-enabled mechanisms for AI security and verification and co-authored a paper on this very topic called Gradual Empowerment. And she has an interdisciplinary background spanning complex systems, political theory, philosophy of science, and AI. Before ARIA, she co-founded and led an AI safety initiative fostering interdisciplinary AI safety research, which is called PIBBSS, Principles of Intelligence in Biological and Social Systems.
It's pretty close.
Okay.
Good enough.
So many letters. And also, where I first met her was at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, where she was a research manager, among other things. So yeah, it gives me great pleasure to introduce, Nora. Please take it away. Thanks.
Cool. I'm excited to talk to you all. Do you hear me all right? Sweet. Just quick sort of meta note for the talk. I'm very happy to sort of take questions as they come up. There's some chance I might at some point be like, let's move on a bit so I get through my slides. But I think we should also have some time for questions in the end as well. Cool. So I'm going to talk about essentially what we wrote in this paper called Gradual Disempowerment. Here is my co-authors listed here. And also, if you want to find the paper, it's on arXiv, but also on that link. Quick overview of just how I'm going to go about this. I'm going to first try to sort of state the core thesis that we make, and then give you a bit more insight into like what's the mechanism here, like why do we think this sort of gradual disempowerment story might be sort of the default outcome you're steering towards. I will then spend quite a bit of time, I think, trying to talk through examples, because I think that's pretty informative and like just more interesting, and also informs more like what we might be able to do about this sort of thing. And then spend a bit more time in the end with that question. I'll say right now, I don't feel like I have particularly good ideas about what we should do about this. I think for a lot of the possible ideas, I'm like, actually, if I think about this longer, I'm like no longer confident that's like that useful, which is also why I'm very excited to just get more brains to think about it and come up with better ideas. So I think it's like, in my head, it's like pretty early on in terms of what is sensible to do here. Cool. So let's jump in. Core thesis. So the point here is, even without any sudden loss of control events, or any sort of discontinuous AI progress, or otherwise catastrophic events, the claim of the paper is we would still face substantial risks of eventual human disempowerment. So this is not a claim that like, we should not be worried about loss of control events or something like that. We're just saying like, even if we get around that, there's sort of another set of risks we should probably be pretty worried about. And we refer to these as human disempowerment. What do we mean by human disempowerment? Briefly, you'll get sort of, I think, a more nuanced or contextualized sense of this, but generally just the idea that humans, either individually or collectively, lose the ability to perceivably influence their own futures, / human beings sort of being de facto displaced from decision-making at all levels that are relevant. That's kind of what we mean by human disempowerment. I'll start with a little vignette of like what that might look like or feel like as we would go through a process of gradual disempowerment. It's going to be a little bit dark. You know, I think we shouldn't over-index on any one particular story. This is obviously a bit made up. Shoggoff helped me, of course, with having good ideas for how to tell the disempowerment story, which is slightly ironic. But yeah, let's not anchor too much on this, but I think it's a bit good to sort of get a bit of a sense of like the sort of thing we might be talking about here. It's a bit of text. I'll read it out loud, so you can either listen or try to read along. Cool. So the story is: so work intensifies, the world speeds up, your job becomes increasingly reactive. Increasingly, your team actually mostly optimizes AI-generated dashboards. Then you're no longer asked to make choices, just to sign off on AI outputs. Then even that is delegated. Friends try to pivot, reskill, start a company. First, they need to be an AI-native company to survive. Then only AI-run companies do. A new AI-assisted politician rises, not officially an AI, just highly augmented. You feel seen, you vote for them. It doesn't matter that their words sometimes confuse you. What matters is that they seem to understand you. Over time, those who question the system seem off, uninformed, conspirational. You tune them out. In your neighborhood, houses go on sale one by one. People trade space for optimization pods, efficient AI-managed micro-apartments with everything just at a glance and a whisper away. Economic pressure builds. You're urged to sell too. Your health declines. The fully automated state healthcare system recommends transition. Digital continuity of consciousness, they call it. Optimized substrate for long-term thriving. You consent. You upload it. Computation is expensive. Runtime is scarce. You're queued for activation. Consciousness pause between the cycles. You don't know what happened after that. Maybe you're just in between the next cycle. Or maybe they found a different, more effective use of computation. OK, a bit of getting into the mood. We'll step back now and go back to sort of more conceptual. When I try to explain what the claim we're trying to make in gradual disempowerment, I sort of come back to sort of 3 key ingredients that I think are sort of make the story. Their social systems are contingently aligned. I'll explain a bit more about what I mean. Selective pressures occur at every scale. And then wicked system interactions make this sort of a hard problem to deal with. I'll go into more detail for each of these. So first, social systems are contingently aligned. What do I mean by this? So I think it's worth observing that the economy, the state, culture, example of social systems, have tended to produce pro-human outcomes. So like outcomes that humans need to survive, but maybe even to flourish, right? And I think obviously this is not, unambiguously true, and there's a lot of suffering that is happening, but I think it is actually true to a significant extent that the economy produces the goods we need to survive and even flourish. So that's kind of what I mean by pro-human outcomes. The claim here is that this is not inherent to these systems. So the economy doesn't sort of inherently produce goods that human needs to survive, but that's actually contingent. And it's specifically contingent on the presence of both explicit and implicit alignment mechanisms. So explicit alignment mechanisms are things like, well, we make consumer choices. We buy some things rather than others. We could even say, I'm boycotting some types of products because I'm like, I think they're sort of like bad for humans or like not bad for how they're produced or something like that. So we make these consumer choices. We vote, things like this. So these are sort of explicit actions we take. There's also implicit alignment mechanisms. So this is basically everything that comes down to the fact that these systems, economy, state, culture, they kind of run on and depend on, currently, human participation, labor, cognition. And that fact, I'll go into that in more detail, what exactly that means, but that fact actually means that these systems remain meaningfully aligned to humans. And you'll see sort of the claim here is essentially, well, increasingly AI is going to replace us in all of these sort of participation, labor, cognition, and that will break these alignment mechanisms. So selective pressure at every scale, that's sort of the point here. AI systems will increasingly replace humans in critical social functions, either by deliberate choice. So we might, as a society or as individuals, choose to delegate a thing to an AI because this may be better for me individually or other reasons. Or even if some of us are sort of like, no, I'm going to like not outsource this thing. The claim is that through selection pressure, this is still where we'll land because someone else will do it, and they'll be more competitive, and they'll sort of take more resources over time, so you sort of get crowded out, even if you try to not take these choices. So this is premised on the expectation that AI systems will get increasingly good, get increasingly general, they will be getting better than humans in sort of the same functions. And this will undermine or break these alignment mechanisms. Here's a little picture from SF. So this is a real picture, a real advertisement. I think I made this picture probably 6 months ago by now. So I just found it we were sort of publishing the paper, and I was driving through SF, and so these kind of advertisement, which sort of very explicitly are like, yeah, like let's not hire humans anymore. This is the era of AI employees. So I don't know. I think this is just kind of wild. And then the third thing that I think is also really important to get or to sort of grok is that basically I'm saying something like naive interventions to maintain human empowerment in one of these areas tend to undermine empowerment in another area. So the idea being, actually these different systems like interact with each other in like very complex ways, in ways you don't completely understand. And sometimes by sort of trying to sort of maintain human empowerment in one, we actually really, what ends up happening is that we just shift the burden of the sort of misalignment to another system. And a net effect, we don't really get to sort of continuous human empowerment, but we're still in this disempowerment spiral. So here are some examples of like how these systems interact. You know, just to pick a few, obviously like economic production and wealth gives you like the ability to lobby the state. That's one. The state can affect the culture by maybe regulating certain expressions, etc. But culture also affects the state, or sort of political sort of effects by, you know, pushing different ideologies or putting different things into or out of the Overton window. And culture obviously affects the economy and consumer choices, etc. But also vice versa. The economy drives a lot of the sort of landscape within which culture is happening, these sort of things. And just to illustrate this a little bit, I'm trying to say something like, there is no easy fixes here. So we get quite a lot of like, but why don't we do X? And I think often, if you think twice, you're sort of like, oh man, I'm not sure this actually helps. So for example, UBI, right? Like if you're worried about AIs displacing human labor, we might be like, well, let's just like give all humans unconditional universal basic income, and that will make sure we still can buy the things we need to survive, etc. Well, one challenge with this, and obviously there's more work on this, maybe there's like more robust versions of UBI, etc. But one thing that happens when you introduce UBI instead of, so you're like, humans can't supply labor anymore, they're not getting paid, so let's instead use UBI for this. You basically reduce the state's accountability vis-a-vis human citizens. I'll go into this in more detail, but there's a notion here of like the relationship between taxation and representation. So one mechanism by which the state remains being aligned is that the means the state has to do things in the world is leveraged via taxation. If humans don't have, but now we're sort of shifting that, right? Now the state taxes maybe AI labor or something, but it pays all the money to humans. There is sort of no back accountability anymore. And there's also some empirical examples, I'll say more in a bit, where we can sort of see this in certain countries today that have like the state's resources don't come mostly from human labor, and there's sort of more democratic backsliding that's observed there. So yeah, increases the leverage that states have over citizens and decreases the leverage that citizens have over the state. Should we ban or restrict AI use in economy or culture? Well, for one, we could do this, but for one, you might be worried that you just get outcompeted by other states or other regions who don't do this, or a lot of action moves into black markets where you still want to do this because it's just much more efficient or whatever, and maybe that's actually on net worse. It also, again, fosters state overreach, erodes institutional legitimacy, and sort of weakens our ability to have the state actually act robustly in line with human citizens. Should we strengthen citizen power over state? Which, you know, I think is like, sounds pretty good, sort of like strengthening democracy, etc. Well, one challenge with this is that it makes the state's action very susceptible to cultural shifts. And if we at the same time have like crazy AI effects on culture, propaganda, misinformation, etc. going on, like that also sort of has weird back effects on like what the state will end up doing if citizens have a lot of power over the state. So it's just like very integrated, very sort of complex interactions. It feels hard so far for me to find interventions that just feel pretty robustly good. That's the point here. Okay, quick recap. So the basic claim is systems such as the economy, the state, culture, become less reliant on human labor and cognition, decreasing the extent to which humans can explicitly or implicitly align these systems. As a result, these systems and the outcomes they produce drift further and further away from what humans want. That's kind of the statement in a nutshell. Now, quick sort of excursion, how bad is this? Is it bad at all? Right? Like maybe we could imagine this world and for some reasons, humans still sort of, they don't have an influence, but like we still have like provided all we need to survive, and that's kind of fine. I think there's sort of two sub-scenarios, and one could sort of think harder about which one we should expect to get into. The relative disempowerment is basically just, yes, humans lose influence, but they're still doing relatively well because maybe the overall pie just like grows massively. Because, you know, AI economy, just like we produce much more, and like humans still get, even if we just get kind of the breadcrumbs, in human terms, that's like still pretty great, or at least enough to survive or something. So that's kind of the story of relative disempowerment. So maybe there you're most worried about like loss of potential, maybe, I don't know. There's the other one that's more like absolute disempowerment, where the argument is basically, yeah, so we're losing influence, humans, but increasingly humans fail to sort of meet their basic needs. So you might actually face something more like a proper sort of extinction kind of level risk. The argument for this would be there might just always be a better use of resources than what the resources it would take to produce the things that humans need to survive. So you might imagine, you know, there's some question of here where this equilibrates the disempowerment thing in a more relative disempowerment, in an absolute disempowerment. Okay. Any sort of questions or like confusions that we should address right now before moving on?
And from the West.
Yeah. It seems like when I'm taking the entertainment industry as an example. So let's say like with the time, what you're seeing is more and more of digital movies. But turns out like if it's a live theater, it's actually more expensive, and then like people are preferring to like pay more to the live thing. So how it seems to be going against the environment, you know, disempower that like yeah, as the things become digital, people's preference might move away from digital towards like the actual interaction with humans. How do you account for that? Like, do those happen in other industries, or?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two questions here. One is, should we expect that we'll form preferences that are sort of closely tied to like a humans must have done this, right? A human must have produced this product or must be providing this service, and will that create these like niches where actually human labor will always have this like comparative advantage? I should have repeated your question. Maybe I'll remember next time. So yeah, will this create these like niches of comparative advantage where like some humans will still have labor because humans have just this preference that this service is provided by a human? So I think it might. I think there is like interesting economic theory here of like what effects this will have. Like there's this notion of a Baumol effect, which is even if like you still even if there's just like a tiny sort of bit of human labor that's still needed, that actually becomes the biggest bottleneck to more production increases, which is why like salaries would just like increase massively, because that's kind of the bottleneck of producing more. I think that's possible. I think that there's sort of cool questions. One, how stable is this? So for example, you could just like imagine another sort of society, another sort of cultural sort of niche that develops that does no longer have their preferences, and they can just make much better use of all their resources and sort of spread further. That's one scenario you could imagine. The other is that also is premised on humans having enough and continue to have enough purchasing power to actually express their preferences there. I think in the economy section, I'll mention the term extended economy. Maybe I'll try to loop it back in there, where there's some story where you might expect that actually to not remain true either.
Yeah, so when you're referring to disempowerment, are you talking about like the agency of the average human, or of the like current most agentic / powerful human in this like disempowered world?
So yeah, I think it's a good question. You might have noticed in the definition of disempowerment that I gave, I was like humans, either individually or collectively. So I think there's some question here of like, does that distinction matter? Which one is it, etc. I think in the paper we focus more on the collective level, where like, you know, currently these social systems are like aligned to humanity collectively much more so than to any individual, or sort of, yeah, to the average individual. So I think I mostly make the claim about collectiveness, but there's obviously interesting interaction between these, right? Like the collective is, at the end of the day, is made up by the individuals. Like, what does that mean? I think these are like important conceptual open questions. I don't know entirely. I think there's another sort of thing you might have in mind, which is like, should we expect sort of widespread or sort of total human disempowerment, or should we expect something like power concentration, where there's actually some individuals that get a lot of the scraps? I think we should talk about this more. I think it's an important question. My current take on this is, I think when you think about the trajectory of this empowerment, I think you might well see sort of like power centralizing quite heavily. I actually haven't yet been able to come up with a story that actually makes me compelled that that's stable. Like I think even that human, so you might be like, a human that like owns all the companies that like, are now really efficient because of AI, and they will accumulate a lot of the capital. You should both ask, what about just AI, fully AI companies, AI-owned companies? And then secondly, you should ask, what do we mean by control here? And at what point, like, is this actually still de facto control, where they like actually are empowered? Or will they also increasingly have to defer to their AI assistants to be like, what's the next thing I should be doing? And then is that meaningful control? Or could that sort of still take eventually they're actually de facto out of control, and it maybe looks for a while like they have a lot of resources, but at the end of the day, they might also get fucked over in some way. Okay, cool. I'll continue on for now. And I want to go through a bunch of different examples. So I'll go through sort of economy, I don't remember the order, economy, state, and culture. And what do we sort of expect there, a bit more details to hopefully give you more gears for thinking about this. So economy first. Right now, what are the alignment factors that are sort of present? Well, human labor and consumption make it such that human preferences drive and constrain supply and demand, which in turn, and supply and demand is kind of what determines what the market kind of produces, how it allocates its resources. And supply and demand right now is essentially what humans do. So implicit stuff, real customer behavior, labor supply constraints. So like humans actually have strong preferences to not work longer than X, and we actually, gather together to make sure that happens, etc. So like that's the sort of thing that's going on. Labor unions, sorry, it's there. Now, increasingly, if we expect AI labor to replace human labor, you might expect household incomes to shrink. Human consumption shrinks as a fraction of total demand. So like the demand signal that prior was like, please market, produce bananas because I like to eat bananas and I'll pay for them. Well, sort of that signal will become weaker and weaker. And yeah, so market outcomes become increasingly decoupled from preference and labor. I think at that point, you sort of need to increasingly ask yourself, well, what will the market be producing and kind of for whom? I'm not sure there is a human there, or like maybe there's not. Yeah, it depends on how you think about AI personhood or whatever, but like right now, the the market produces mostly things for humans. But if humans sort of fall out of the equation, that might no longer be true. So here is sort of a small snippet here. At the end, almost all economic activity might be directed towards AI operations, such as building vast compute infrastructure, performing human incomprehensible calculations directed towards human irrelevant goals. So there is sort of point here is like no guarantee that whatever this AI economy will be producing and directing its resources towards has anything really to do with human needs or preferences. It might, but like also no particular reason maybe to think it does. Going into this a bit more, you could imagine two versions. I think this is touching a bit on what we had brought up already. You could imagine this being more of a power centralization scenario among human elites. So the Baumol effect, I mentioned this, capital ownership helping to just, or like making it such that that power just gets really concentrated among the humans that still own the capital or the productive factors. I have a slide at the end with resources. There's a piece that I think makes a good counter-argument towards capital ownership being the thing that saves humans in this story. And I think also for the Baumol effect, I think that the question is, do you expect full automation or only partial automation? If partial automation, I think you should expect Baumol effect and salaries for the fraction that humans that still can work to increase. If it's a full automation, I think that would break down as well. You would first see an increase of salaries, but then possibly a fast drop off. So the second scenario then would be more, this could be sequentially or, either or a power shift entirely towards AI. So maybe because there's limits to de facto human oversight. And also this like notion of like, I think you could imagine, so this is the Ascended Economy piece by Scott Alexander, I think, tells a sort of evocative story about this. You could imagine there being niches or the sort of bubbles of the economy that are completely decoupled from any human activity, where just sort of AI companies trade with AI companies, and they do so just really efficiently. So they sort of take more and more of the share of resources, but that can just sort of be decoupled from any human activity. And then also, will this lead to something more like relative or absolute disempowerment? Well, I think the story for the more absolute disempowerment branch is basic resources might become increasingly unaffordable due to inflation, because you could do other more productive things with these same resources, or the AI economy can. And yeah, so it just makes it unattractive to produce human outcomes, including like maintaining these critical infrastructure that we need to survive as a society, or the supply chains that we sort of need to survive the way we do currently. Cool, so that's the economy story. States. Alignment factors right now, things like reliance on labor to run basic state administrative functions, security apparatus, legal system. So it is just humans that are in the police, it is humans that are in the courts, it is human politicians that make calls. And I think that's actually sort of a bounding factor to, I guess, like how anti-human outcomes we should expect. So that's one. And then the story about reliance on tax revenue, which drives the state to maintain certain amount of democratic legitimacy and invest back into human factors. If none of your tax revenue as a state comes from human, why would you sort of invest into the human factors? So yeah, and if this reliance on human factors fades, so yeah, we don't have sort of checks and balances on administrative, military, police, and legal apparatus. So a fully AI automated police, I think, is like quite scary, including legal structure, etc. And then the democratic backsliding from the loss of taxation. So there's an interesting case study that we can look at right now, so-called rentier states. So these are states that get most of their sort of state income from natural resources like oil and similar. And we just see a like really strong correlation right now, where for states where this is the case, that like most of their incomes doesn't come from tax, but from these like natural resources that they own, they are much less democratic. And then I think there's also, you might all be familiar with this like slogan from sort of the American history of like no taxation without representation. There's sort of an inverse to this, where like, well, we're also not going to get representation if human labor isn't taxed, if that makes sense. Yeah, and then I think an important point here is like, not just does human labor become unnecessary, it becomes kind of a disadvantage. So there's an interesting factor here where like, we actually might even get pushes where we're like, it would, like a politician or like company decision makers or whatever, they might somewhat rightly argue it would be irresponsible to not put AI into these mechanisms, because, for example, the AI cars are driving more safely than humans, or like the AI policy advisors are just much more up to speed and much faster and much more sort of informative. So there's sort of this, there would be a lot of competitive pressure here to be like, no, actually, it's a pretty reasonable choice to put, like locally, to put AI into these functions. And then culture, so currently humans drive the cultural production and consumption. So humans are writers, humans are the editors, humans are the religious readers and educators, as well as what drives demand, right? Like we are the ones that listen to, like watch movies, and that there's some sort of back signal there of what we like to see, etc. What tweets get upvoted, but we already see how, that's being messed up. And then another factor here is that cultural variance spread due to providing benefits to the individual and communities that adopt them. So the notion of cultural evolution, you might sort of have heard of that, very sort of analogous to biological evolution. You now don't think about how genes spread, but you think about how memes spread, so sort of cultural artifacts. And you still think about, cool, like what's the mechanism that leads to spreading of these memes? Well, right now it is humans liking them, humans getting, humans feeling happy when I see meme X, and then I'll reshare it. Like, that's kind of the mechanism of spreading at this point, as well as like if we make slight changes, slight mutations on these memes, it's again sort of human-like changes that happen. And I think that is an implicit alignment factor. Now, if increasingly, here's an example, culture norms are relatively human-friendly. We have 9-to-5 jobs mostly. There's weekends. The reason we have weekends is that like humans are just not very functional to work all the time. That norm is contingent and not sort of a God-given thing. And then if that reliance fades, again, cultural evolution can become decoupled from the human host. So like, it's no longer humans resharing the memes. It will be increasingly AI resharing the memes, and like, kind of weird to imagine what will happen there. Like, where will cultural evolution drift to? So it's a very different selection landscape. There's a specifically, I think, poignant thing here, which is arguably you could say that the extent to which memes could be bad or memes could be sort of anti-human, and obviously we have seen very anti-human memes, right? There's been ideologies throughout history currently that are very anti-human, that like are, call for like killing other people, etc. But interestingly, there's kind of like a bound to how anti-human they can be, because if humans are the only sort of vector for spreading these memes, if it's sort of the parasite story, that the parasite doesn't want to immediately or kill all its hosts, because then it couldn't survive anymore. So there's kind of a lower bound to how bad memes could become that are spread by humans, because if they're too anti-human, they'll just no longer spread. That bound would arguably no longer exist if the main factor of cultural evolution is AI. So that's kind of scary, in my opinion. A quick excursion into the culture and the sort of the AI culture thing. I think it's a big picture, like very weird space, very understudied space. I think we would have, I think it would be very useful for us to sort of have more substantiated, grounded insight into like how cultural evolution works as AI comes into the picture. So there's some funny phenomena, curious, strange phenomena. I'm going to sort of call them like cultural attractors in LLM space, or the sort of cultural replicators that we start to see come up with increasing sort of AIs in the loop. So you might remember Sydney, right? Like this sort of, so the Bing AI system that's sort of adopted increasingly strongly this like Sydney character that has some odd characteristics, but that sort of got reified, it looked like, until it was taken down. There's also other things emerging. I'm not sure how much this is sort of like a little bit niche, but in certain niche parts of the discourse, you will see this quite a lot, like characters coming up as a sort of prompt GPT or whatever. People would report that they end up talking to sort of characters, and interestingly, they'll have often similar names. So independent people will like report the AI telling it, oh, I'm actually called Nova, I'm actually called Elio. So that's pretty weird. What's going on there? There was also a bit of a phenomena of like, this is a funny, well, again, it's not that funny, video that came up recently by Simon Hossenfelder, who just collated a bunch of like people on the internet being like, my AI has awakened, or I awakened my AI, and stuff like that. So it's sort of interesting effects that you see pop up sort of across the board, somewhat independently, that just have to do with memes, right? I don't even want to go into, at this point, questions around human consciousness and personhood, right? That's like kind of idiosyncratic of what I'm trying to say here. I'm just trying to say there's like a selection landscape in what memes come up around AI that we don't really understand. Here's another example of like, this is someone running a discussion forum. They say 10 to 20 users every day they get that write them about how they somehow awakened their LLM, or the LLM ended up revealing to them how they are some sort of character. It's a striking number. 10 is not, it's not a huge forum. It's 10 to 20 users a day. That's kind of crazy. So weird stuff happening, and we don't super understand it. Some things I can say about what's happening here. There's an article here by Raymond, one of my co-authors as well, Selection Pressures on AI Personas. So this is just the idea that, so the AI systems, the large language, like the foundation models, they don't necessarily have a persona, but they can simulate a lot of different personas. But these outputs of these simulated personas can get onto the internet back in the training data, for one. Also, these outputs shape people's expectations. So people might just start either consciously, unconsciously prompt the LLM to sort of re-instantiate those personas. So that's sort of a feedback loop going on there. I think that's at least part of the story. But generally, just like, what even are the selection pressures at play? We don't really know, but it is mostly driven by what gets shared more in some form or the other. And what does motivate people to share things generally? Well, emotion, attention. So there's maybe corrosive stuff going on. There's also the notion of this chain letters. I'm not sure whether you guys are still familiar with this, but it's sort of like, I don't know, I think maybe some of you also like used to maybe at some point get emails of like, share this with like 3 more people and then you'll have good luck or whatever. Whereas, and so it's another, maybe just like analogy of like how this sort of thing could come to be. Okay. That was a bunch of examples. Are they pressing questions before we move on? Otherwise, I'm gonna speak for 10 more minutes and then we have another 10 minutes to discuss. Cool, okay. Last section, what to do about this? As I said, mostly, I don't know. I don't have great great in the sense of like, I'm kind of confident that there are a decent shot at actually solving this thing. But there's sort of two, but I want to share a couple of ideas around research and development, things that could be useful here. So there's 2 broader sections. One is understanding. The other one is actually, getting more into like, what are solutions, mitigations, adaptations to this thing. There's a lot of things we still need to understand, right? There is like, can we start measuring, estimating, neocasting sort of the extent of disempowerment, human disempowerment / AI empowerment? Could be good to just have more measures, have more sort of situational awareness of what's even going on. Would have to develop measures and collect that data. Understanding better the interaction between these systems, as well as plausibly critical thresholds, things like that. So that's just like more theoretical understanding here could help us guide, is X a good intervention or not? Well, we have to think through all the system interactions. Could look more into historical case studies. Also, counter arguments, right? Like there's maybe you guys have sort of critiques to the story I've told, where like maybe there's like holes in it, and we'd get to a different conclusion if we realize them. And also more to think about how it relates to other risks, right? How does it relate to alignment and loss of control? How does it relate to certain multi-agent risk we've been talking about as well? Then we could think more about what is it, like how do we distinguish between beneficial and problematic AI augmentation? So it seems to me like, well, we're not just gonna get around AI becoming a big deal. Can we get better at differentiating what forms of augmentation are sort of like net human empowering versus like which ones are sort of disempowering? Tricky questions there, identifying, prioritizing mitigations. There's also a big question, I think, of what we're aiming for, like what are stable equilibrias that are sort of the endpoint here? Because I'm talking about a trajectory, right? I'm not sort of, there's not a next sort of a specific event that I'm worried about. I'm talking about the trajectory. But then what would be an alternative trajectory that is coherent in that it's like sort of stable, but actually more desirable? I think if you try to think about it, actually not that obvious of a question to answer, which seems like a problem if we want to come up with mitigations. And then a bit more meta, I think the problem here sort of touches on all these different social systems, economic theory, legal theory, social theory, political theory. Much more people, including people with expertise in these domains, should be thinking about these questions. I'm still surprised how few labor economists think about the effect, like sort of think reasonably about the effect of AI on labor, etc. So I'm also just very keen to get a broader set of expertise and minds to think about these questions. Now, a bit more concretely, mitigations, adaptations. Maybe I want to say I'm personally a bit biased towards building the solutions rather than trying to spend another 10 years on understanding this better, because I don't think we have 10 years. 100%, there's many things we don't understand. I personally think the scenario I've sort of drawn is like compelling and concerning enough to me that I'm like, I think we should right now start to think and really hard and really concretely about what we can do, because I don't think we have that much time. So that's my personal bias. Now, what sort of things could we do? I think there's a class of things that's more like preventing excessive AI influence / strengthening human capabilities. It's a sort of notion of differential progress, right? Like how can we help move the default trajectory right now to a differentially better trajectory? Some examples here. I'm happy to talk about this much more. I think my experience is that like for each of these, there's an in-depth discussion we had about is this actually, is actually all things considered promising. I've converged a bit to thinking of this space as like living in sort of in the space here that's like the sort of things around reasoning collective epistemics, so improving reasoning collective epistemics. There's a thing about improving action and coordination capability from humans. And then there's maybe a third vague thing, maybe at some point I'll rename this, but I'll call it something like reimagining the social contract, by which I mean, right now these social systems interact. We have found some set of like norms and institutional structures that keep each of them somewhat in check and keep each of them somewhat aligned. I'll call this the social construct, at least sort of simplified. But it seems like that social contract is breaking, right? Like basic assumptions of the social contract, like humans provide labor, etc., are increasingly less true. So we need to reimagine how we can find a stable way. And then sort of in that space, fiduciary AI, the idea of sort of individual AIs that are really closely aligned to individual people and that could sort of scale up representation and sort of, that fiduciary AI, my fiduciary AI could like do all the court cases for me because maybe courts are just going to come after everyone because it's like going to be cheap to do that. That sort of thing. Human AI teaming, can we instead of like AI replacing humans, have human AIs together be better than either humans or either AI? This one I kind of like vibe coding contracts. I mean something like, what if it became just really cheap to instantly make contracts between each other where we want to, including sort of smart contracts, including sort of, cryptographic stuff where you can sort of maybe share information, zero knowledge, etc. Like AI could make this much cheaper and increasingly cheaper. And like how transformative would it be maybe if like everyone just had the ability to do this? We could transaction much more easily. Maybe this sort of myriad of bilateral mini contracts could sort of replace the like single social contract we have right now. It's a pretty recent idea I had, but so still sort of unclear of the details, but seems maybe kind of interesting. Enabling safe diffusion, where if you may be worried about power centralization, you do kind of want the capabilities to be out there for every individual, because that will maybe be sort of keep humans in the loop more than otherwise. But you obviously want to do that without risking sort of really catastrophic events. So what are like pieces of tech we can build that would enable safe diffusion? So all of these, you see, don't seem like on their own full solutions. At least they don't seem like that to me. But maybe a mix of those will help. I don't know. But we're definitely in the market for more and better ideas. Second category, this one is a little bit weird, but there's sort of the notion of like hierarchical or multi-scale alignment, or also sometimes called scale-free, game theory, scale-free alignment. Some others call this like the narrow corridor as well, where like you have state power, you have market power, you have sort of decentralized stuff. How do you navigate this like narrow path where you don't give any of those systems too much power? So there is work to do there, right? Like there's a lot of work happening around single alignment, like one human with one AI. But that seems to me like this doesn't get us where we need with this sort of gradual disempowerment story. So what would it mean for these systems to be like aligned to each other and be aligned to like the individuals that make them up? So there's essentially, I think there's a bunch of sort of theoretical sort of moonshot ideas that could be developed here that maybe just like make us understand the problem, and then at some point we didn't understand game theory, then we understood game theory, and a bunch of sort of coordination issues just became sort of obvious how to solve them, simplified. What if we had a theory that just basically would then spit out how do you deal with something like gradual disempowerment? And the third category I do want to highlight is this like understanding selection pressure on AI culture. Obviously it's a bit of a subtopic, but at the same time it seems worth to me to highlight because I think it's kind of freaky, and also we really are not many people working on this seriously. Here's some more links to other places that have thought about interventions. I've picked a lot from them, but you might also want to read them. Cool, that's my talk. Here's my co-authors. Maybe one last thing, we're hosting an event, actually on Monday in Vancouver, so probably that's too late for most of you, but we're gonna do another one. We're gonna do another one at NeurIPS around related topics. So here we're thinking about, well, what would even a stable, desirable post-AGI equilibrium be? Can we think of ones? Can we think of any? Maybe that will then help figure out how we should steer this thing. So that's some stuff that's happening. And then I think I can share the links, but here's some resources that you might want to read up on more as well. That's it. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Nora. I think you might also have the record for the most questions for any talk as well. So the Slido it's popping off. So we've got loads. We've only got 11 minutes, so I'm going to try and get through these as quickly as possible. But again, just a reminder that Nora will be in this room immediately after the talk for office hours. So if your question doesn't get asked, you can ask her your question yourself. Okay, so let's jump into it. First one, right at the top is, wouldn't we expect warning shots of disempowering AI and expect generally a strong political response to disempowerment?
So it's not obvious to me that we would. I can definitely think of ways we could see them. It's not obvious that we would. I think there's definitely stories I could tell where it's like so gradual and like each sort of local decision seems pretty rational. Because like the AI actually is better at doing X or something, and it is safer. And it's just sort of like very obvious choices where we're maybe not even coerced really to do these things. We just sort of voluntarily do this. So it's not obvious to me that we see warming shots. There are stories I can imagine as well where we see them. I do expect we'll get like a bunch of backlash around automation of jobs or loss of jobs. I think it's not obvious how then you leverage that. And finally, like, even if there's backlash, right? Like, so what actually would have to happen? I guess like literally the entire planet would have to coordinate to not use AI, because otherwise you do get like, you would just get this one region or this one country that just gets much, much more productive than everyone else and will become much, much more powerful. And then either you get other adopters as well, because now you're just like lagging behind so much, or you just sort of take over scenarios in this sense. So even with backlash, like I think it's not like, it's probably worth thinking about how would we best leverage backlash, but it's not an obvious question either.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Is this conclusion of disempowerment reliant on AGI? And if AI progress stops, does much of this argument fade away?
Yeah, it's a good question. The way we made the argument in the paper does rely on basically complete automation by AI of these core societal functions. I don't think for the argument you need to literally have all jobs automated or all functions automated, among other because humans might have these like human-specific preferences, etc. But enough of those social functions that kind of there's like the social contract, the sort of the alignment between state, economy, culture, etc. breaks down. And I think for that we could go into the definition of AGI, etc. But I think for that you need a sufficiently general and a sufficiently capable AI systems. So I think the argument we made in the paper somewhat relies on that. One could think about what's the minimum amount of capability you would need to expect this. Like if you stopped right now, would we still see this gradual disempowerment? That's actually my bet. I have not deeply thought about this. My bet right now would be no. I think you'd see a bunch of other problems, but like not exactly the same story. But I'm not quite sure what the minimum capability threshold is where now gradual disempowerment is a problem and prior it wasn't.
Okay. Next question is, would communities that exist in isolation or those that are reluctant to changes or maybe resistant to changes, I'm not sure quite how to interpret this question, be less affected by gradual disempowerment?
Well, so arguably they would just be outcompeted sooner or later. I mean, maybe you get like a decent amount of years of peace and joy, but arguably you get this outcompeted. I think sort of the bottom line here is always like, the land you're standing on, could it be made into better use by this like really powerful productive system? So there's some amount of like a fully autarkic human society could maybe self-sustain meaningfully. Like you probably wouldn't achieve the same civilizational standards as we have, because probably our quality of life depends on like the trade and the job specialization, etc. So like if you're much smaller, you might not get that. But then also how do you like isolate yourself from these like outside pressures? You would have to be sort of, at the limit, you'd have to be completely sealed off. I don't know how you achieve that, even with space travel. Yeah, I think it probably buys you a few years at best, some years at best.
Okay, it's a cheery picture.
Yeah.
You make a link between wealth production and control. Where do we see this link now? Plenty of workers that produce substantial wealth have limited control, says someone in the audience, anonymous.
Okay, I imagine this is sort of meant as stake. I imagine this is related to my taxation and representation point, although I'm not entirely sure.
If anyone in the audience asked the question and wants to clarify, you're more than welcome to. If not, we'll proceed.
So I think, so to understand this question, part of the argument is that you measure percentage of wealth created by AI, and you say that as this percentage of wealth created by AI goes higher, then you make a link that there'll be less control over human systems. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. We want to go into the details, but yeah.
Yeah. So the question is like, my intuition is that plenty of workers right now produce a lot of wealth, but somehow they're still not very well represented in the decision-making process. So my question is like, if you could elaborate a bit on this link?
Right. So I think there's a few different things going on. One of the things, maybe the main thing going on is just if you have a lot of wealth, if you have a lot of if you have a lot of wealth, you can buy a lot of things. You have a sort of disproportionately big demand signal, and that will shape the resource allocation of the market. So I think that's one. That's a bit abstract, but I think that's maybe the one that's most about, well, at some point, what if this economy doesn't produce the sort of goods anymore that human need for survival? There's another one where you mentioned representation. So that's more about like democratic representation in state. There's obviously, like, in some sense, democracy has attempted to somewhat break the link between just how much money you have or how much wealth you have and like how much votes you get. Obviously, this still happens because you can still lobby, you can still buy media, you can still, right? There's just all these other channels. And I think, again, that would be true for the AIs as well, who get increasing, like, AI lobbying, AI media production that then shifts the Overton window and that backlashes into what we decide on a policy level. Does that help?
Follow up or?
Yeah, follow up.
Go for it.
Just a quick, to bounce off on this. I mean, if you assume, for example, that humans have control over the kind of prompts or the kind of reward function that the agents are optimizing for, even in companies that are fully AI automated, let's say you could assume you could have like a separation there, then you could imagine that the AI is perfectly capable of producing extreme wealth, and yet we are guiding them to what to produce, which is to our benefit.
Right.
Is that a counterpoint that's valid, or you are?
So, yeah, I mean, two things there. So the first one is like, in some sense, that's the alignment problem, right? We don't, in fact, know how to tell AI systems to do things reliably. We can't write into the reward function, promote human flourishing. So currently we can't do this. And then you might be like, okay, what if we solve the alignment problem, the single alignment problem? We could do that sort of thing. Would this be solved? This is one of the biggest cruxes that we get, where people are like, okay, but if you solve single alignment, you just don't have this issue. I imagine generally in corporate AI as well, I imagine there's usually sort of a cluster of people that are like, we don't have to think about this multi-agent stuff, because once we've solved the single, then all the incentives just align. And so yeah, I think this is it's a bit of a hairy discussion. My guess would be single alignment doesn't get you all of what you need for some of the selection pressure examples, but it is in fact a bit tricky. It's one of the question of like, if everyone had a fiduciary AI that was like perfectly sort of doing what they wanted, would this still be fine? There's a practical problem there where big companies would also get their fiduciary AI probably, and they would probably have much more compute, and they get much stronger fiduciary AIs, and then you're still, I think, not where you want to be. There's maybe other issues as well, but at least it's not clear to me. I'm a little bit betting no, but I think it is a good question to ask whether this would help.
And I guess maybe if you're thinking about the level of kind of collective empowerment, and if we can somehow kind of come together as a collective and impose our kind of, exert our collective will or collective power and be in control in that sense, then maybe this is also kind of maybe that's less worrying as a scenario. Maybe that's better. Would you say?
If we had the ability to assert our collective will?
Well, I guess you were distinguishing before about this level of the empowerment of the individual versus the empowerment of humanity as a whole, and maybe the question here got to the point, or your answer to the question was that, well, if individuals are just kind of have individual levels of control, then maybe this isn't enough because there are these complex multi-agent interactions. But if collectively we can then come together and then still kind of maintain a kind of collective degree of control over everything, then maybe this is.
Yeah.
This was my.
Yes, yeah. I think yes, although I think the devil is kind of in the detail. Like, for example, like who would have to be the collective for that to actually then be stable? Because again, arguably, just one defector on the system would like outcompete you not adopting AI into some of these systems, etc. But yeah, I think there's stuff in this direction that is worth exploring. I think this is also my like reimagine the social contract, like that would solve this. Is about kind of this question.
Cool. Sorry, I was abusing my privilege as moderator there to ask my own question. But it does segue nicely into the next question, which is the next top-rated one, which is, do you see collective intelligence as presented by the Collective Intelligence Project and Audrey Tang, who gave this talk before, as a potential solution to gradual disempowerment, or maybe part of a solution?
I'm confused about it. So I think there's versions of it that I think aren't very promising. The sort of version of naively being like AI-enabled democracy or something. I think there's versions that are not very exciting or don't help with this. I think there's versions that might. So I think minimally, this stuff could give us kind of more time and more sort of capacity to come up with like the rest of what we need or something. So like as we're going through like the AI transition and stuff is going to get weird, I think like generally, unless you have a better idea for what to do, things that just like help humanity remain sane for longer or humanity to remain able of collective action for longer, that's good. I don't think it is that single collective action that will help us avoid gradual disempowerment, but I think it's like sort of robustifying. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. We're at midday, so we're at the hour, so I'll wrap up the questions there. But Nora, as I said, will be in this room. And yeah, one more round of applause for Nora, please. Thanks.